Fluid movement, expansive gameplay variety, appealing and, dare I say, timeless aesthetic, abundant and unique enemy types, Ori and the Blind Forest seems to have it all. But I found the game unfulfilling and more frustrating than any other game I've played recently. So, how does one reconcile a reaction so disparate to Blind Forest's apparent value? The most general answer I can provide assumes the form of one word: inconsistency. However, before I investigate that, I'll get the dirty laundry out of the way. This is an in-depth analysis of Ori and the Blind Forest with spoilers, as I'll be discussing every aspect of the game I deem relevant. If you haven't, I suggest playing the game before watching this video to more intuitively grasp the concepts, compliments, and complaints that I'll be voicing. If you'd like to watch this without first playing it, then that's also suitable because I'll be as detailed as possible. There will still be something to learn. Blind Forest is one of the few games that is markedly more satisfying to watch than to play because it features many idiosyncrasies that are visually sensible but functionally non sequiturs. I'm hesitant to make accusations like the following because of any player's ignorance of the design process, but it's possible that the team exhibited some priority to the visuals over the gameplay, and the game's aesthetic beauty is not a motivator in my saying that. Ignorance of the design process is expected of any player, but we have some insight into the process because they package the game with some MVPs, or minimum viable products, of it in development. They began with gray boxes, as any game does, but maybe the priority to the visuals entered later. My accusation originates from behavior of the controls that make little sense in theory and in practice. For example, Ori can both crawl up a wall and perform a typical wall jump sequence. When the player is wall jumping up a vertical surface, Ori's position translates upward and away from the surface before returning to the wall. So, when you approach the top of a vertical surface, or where the ground levels out, why does Ori then leap over the top of it in the direction of the surface instead of performing the same trajectory as Ori did before? This is only one problem of many regarding movement and mobility, but it's a synecdoche for the precision this game lacks in this domain. Movement in most games, unless it's done for a specific reason that contributes to the game's intent, should behave like Newton's first two laws, or in other words, that any object in motion stays in motion in a straight line unless compelled by an outside force. If I'm wall crawling up, which requires the button combination of R2 plus up, I should continue moving up, but I don't for some reason, and rather move right. I used the term non sequitur earlier because it means does not follow, and in this context, it doesn't follow that Ori would move right at the top of a vertical surface if the player didn't input that direction. How this makes sense, I'm wholly and thoroughly unsure. Much of this game's movement doesn't feel tight, however you'd like to describe or interpret that term. It seems like Moon Studios made concessions to make the game more accessible without considering how players with more precise gaming abilities would control Ori. I believe that movement should always form to the needs of the game, rather than exist as a mobility system that favors a style of gameplay that doesn't contextually fit the game's demands. Blind Forest is quickly paced, meaning that it requires higher possible precision over Ori's movement to make it fair. A game like Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice doesn't require painfully precise movement because the game's focus is on story and puzzle solving. But a game like Fury does require painfully precise movement options because the threats are very precise. You must dodge a ball or a line or something with sharply defined boundaries, so operating in a way that can narrowly avoid the threats is required to service the purpose of the game. Blind Forest fits the latter category because you are, indeed, needing to avoid threats like balls and lines. In Fury, Stranger, the name of the protagonist you play, executes exactly what the player commands, no more, no less. In Blind Forest, Ori adds auxiliary movements to what the player commands, and this may work in a game like Assassin's Creed, where creating a fluid-seeming stream of movements is quintessential to selling the Tresor character, but not in a game with the traits of Blind Forest. Continuing with this comparison, all of Stranger's movements are progressive rather than discrete. where a stranger will perform a dash of the length proportional to the duration of the button hold. Ori seems to have discrete jump heights. 3, I reckon. A convention of sorts has popularized in platformer gaming, both 2D and 3D, that when jumping, releasing the button will instantly cause you to descend, or at least stop you from ascending. This allows players to acutely manage their airtime and trajectories that allows a high skill ceiling, but Blind Forest skirts this, it seems. I'm unsure of the exact values, but let's hypothetically assert that Ori's maximum jump height lasts for a 1 second total. If you hold jump for 1 second, you'll achieve the highest possible altitude. Easy, right? But Blind Forest seems to round values to increments. So if you hold jump for 0.1 or 0.2 seconds, you won't travel 0.1 or 0.2 meters. Rather, it'll round to 0.33 or a third. And if you hold it for 0.4 or 0.5 seconds, it'll round to 0.66 or 2/3. So Ori's movement is not directly proportional to button hold time. I never acclimated to this feature because it's extraordinarily unintuitive. You'd think having predetermined heights might generate reliability and predictability because you'll never be surprised with how high you jump, but that'd only be valid if the jump animation conveyed a concise and detectable instant where the ascension switched to descension, and even then it'd be unfavorable. But that's only one variable that contributes to Blind Forest's floaty feeling. There exists a sweet spot of hang time at the max jump height. If the in-game avatar hangs for too long at the top, the movement seems floaty, whereas if it doesn't hang for long enough, then the avatar will seem to be under perpetual high gravity. Ori rests confidently in the former position. Floating movement isn't by necessity an undesirable trait as displayed in Super Metroid, but it is if the floatiness doesn't allow a movement that'd be otherwise accomplishable. In Super Metroid, the floatiness allows you to make micro adjustments in the air because the hang time is exaggerated. Ori's hang time is long, but not over exaggerated, and it also doesn't permit in-air micro adjustments, so because the hang time is unproductive, it makes the movement feel sloppy, like middle school cafeteria mashed potatoes. If you've played the game, you may think that I'm being unreasonably critical and pessimistic about the quality of the controls, and you'd be correct. The movement is adequately manageable, but I'm attempting to paint an image of when the controls are not adequately manageable and behave counterintuitively and counterproductively to your intent. And that happens often enough to justify the boldness of my assertions I've made so far and will continue to make. I'm attempting to illustrate the experience of the controls that I had rather than the isolated attributes of the movement. I also tended not to trust one of the most prolific staples in platforming history, the wall jump, which is one of the most offensive cases where I don't trust the controls to do what I command. If you simultaneously press the direction opposite of the wall Ori's belly is facing and the jump button, you may or may not jump off the wall because you must jump before inputting the direction, so pressing them simultaneously may mean you in fact press jump mere milliseconds after you indicated the direction. It's a problem because you can't consistently maximize the horizontal distance you can cover, and when you can't maximize, you can't establish a standard distance to know whether or not you should be traveling shorter or further in any given context. And when you can't establish a standard distance, you don't trust Ori to execute what you envisaged in your mind's eye. I don't trust the walls as proper foundation to jump off when sliding down them for a significant period of time. And the fact that I use the word foundation as an adjective to qualify walls should offer some hint to how much I trust them. I'm very grateful for the devs' effort in creating unique artwork for all the walls in the game to make it seem unique in every screen. It's a large commitment and not a trivial task. But its deficits show when the player must rely on the walls to not die and operate within these environments. A blocked system is superior, though I'm sympathetic to undermining the visual style of Blind Forest. Ultimately though, function overrides style in the domain of game design, and if I'm meant to have an ability where I can slide down a wall, and that wall is not conveyed as being intentionally aberrated as to inhibit sliding, it's a failure of level and art design to feature a wall that interrupts my sliding. An interruption of any duration and a vertical fall of any distance is unacceptable because it's not a simple adjustment. Because the sliding velocity is constant, it's possible that you'd be looking elsewhere on your monitor to judge how you'd need to time your jump off the wall given some environmental elements in place. However, when your slide is interrupted, you must now snap your eyeballs back to Ori's position and correct this error lest you die. Naturally, you'll have to return to your previous position and re-perform your attempted jump, but it's not always so inconsequential because it may cause a death. Another possibility is you wasting your jump. If you're sliding down a wall and about to execute a wall jump, but Ori unexpectedly loses its grip and begins falling instead of sliding, then the wall jump you were going to do now becomes the second of two of your double jump. That's never far enough to be a proper substitute for the full two jumps, so you quickly have to move back to the wall and try again. And this type of stuff happens all the time, and maybe even every few minutes. This isn't a once a play session frequency, it's a perpetual caution you must acknowledge and do your best to predict. I'd be more forgiving if this game were intentionally intended to test your environmental awareness of specific surface details, but that's not the case. This isn't Dark Souls probing you to notice if you spotted the raised plate on the floor that causes arrows to fly at your face. One of Dark Souls' intended emotional responses is grave uneasiness, and plates and false floors force false faith in your environment such that you're constantly aware of your surroundings, or should be. But you see, these are deliberate design decisions baked into the world as player-object interactions, not happenstance occurrences of poor collision pervading the game. The ambient but ubiquitous violation here is very selective design choices that generate inconsistent moments that detriment the player because he makes a decision under the presumption of consistency but then gets punished for not predicting the game's arbitrary betrayal of previously established tradition. A pernicious inconsistency plagues this game. This also occurs in more obvious occasions of design, like the wind section near the end of the game where the wind goes through the ground at some points but doesn't at others. Granted, a moving wind animation is present in all parts where you'll experience its buoyant effects, but unless it's consistently combined with thematic / visual / art conveyance, it becomes another inconsistency to add to the docket. The long docket. By the way, conveyance is the game representing some information that is about to happen to you through audio, visual means, or both. For example, the mortar enemy has great conveyance because it visually recoils and then extends while making a sound effect that sounds like somebody about to spit out some saliva out of their mouth. So it's reasonable to presume a projectile of some sort will soon come from it. Blind Forest establishes a behavior as possible, then contradicts it either immediately or much later when you're expected to forget the behavior. Here, note that you can crouch under the projectiles to skirt damage. You also can here. But here, you can't. Why? Your guess is as good as mine. I don't think it'd be unarguably justified, but I might accept that you'd take damage on the third platform if it were angled when the others weren't. But even that's not the case. Perhaps this deviation exists because of how the hitboxes are drawn and calculated. Ori's might be approximately a square, and so might this purple projectiles. The first platform shows no issue because the top of Ori's hitbox is parallel to the projectiles. The second platform shows no issue because although the hitboxes aren't parallel, they're parallel enough for it not to cause an issue. But the third platform does allow damage because the projectile's hitbox snips the very corner of Ori's. Now, that's an explanation, but certainly not a justification. My point? Many of the game's segments are internally incompatible. It may seem like I'm simplistically listing instances where the game duped me, and I'm here airing my frustrations, but place more confidence in my scheme. This is intended to make glowingly apparent that many cases of inconsistent design considerations assemble into a deceitful, disloyal, and undependable game as a whole. If the player cannot trust the game, she cannot maximize or optimize her enjoyment of the experience. If I experience a seemingly unintentional quirk once, I'll dismiss it as an oversight. If I do twice, I'll be paranoid throughout the remainder of the playthrough that it'll happen to me again. That may seem like a strict standard reaction, but I bargain that it's the same for you, despite you realizing it or not. I must mention what I think to be a complication that neglected player input. Call me old school, but I prefer playing platformers with the D-pad. I find joysticks to be imprecise because it's difficult to gauge when movement will begin and stop. I used an Xbox One controller, the newer version, to play Blind Forest. I think this controller's D-pad has concise feedback and the distinct clicks make it obvious when you've pressed the direction. However, this is the only game where I've experienced a conflict when using the D-pad due to the bash ability's presence. Bashing often, if not always, requires a close to exact trajectory angle within the 360 degrees, rendering bash an unusable ability with the D-pad, forcing players like me to move their thumb to the joystick. Over time, I acclimated to this switch, but it never felt natural or smooth. More than once, I became mentally frazzled in high-octane situations and died because my brain was calculating the positions of all the objects and enemies on screen, as well as having to make a conscious effort to move my finger to the joystick. This movement becomes increasingly more difficult after you've internalized the controls of the game and rely on the D-pad for all movement. You could posit to me to just completely convert to using the joystick as my means of movement, but not only is that infinitely more difficult to adapt to, but that's also at variance with and undermines the inherent playstyle of Blind Forest, a style that necessitates and encourages gymnastic precision. Don't mistake my gripe here as an advocacy for Bash's removal from the game. In fact, I think it's a novel idea that deserves to exist, and while I'm unsure how to resolve this paradox of the movement methods, I wish it were different. And while I'm discussing abilities and button combinations, I'll mention another oversight regarding the super jump. So, Blind Forest prevents one action overriding another, so it'll execute the second action immediately once it's available to be executed. For example, if you jump, then immediately deploy the feather, or attempt to, it'll deploy once you reach the maximum height of the jump. It's the same with bash, and it's the same with dash, but it's not the same with the super jump. And while this ability comes so late in the game that it's nearly negligible, it still displays its adverse effects during gameplay. To deploy the feather after a super jump, if you're holding down the button, you must release to then repress it to deploy it. A minor contention it may be, but yet another blemish on the face of this game's polish. Sequence breaking is not a thing in this game. Not every platformer of this type requires sequence breaking to be entertaining, but it highly benefits repeat playthroughs, and one of the reasons for my suggestion is because there's not much else to encourage the player to play Blind Forest again. There are no alternate paths of beating the game, little incentive to acquiring all collectibles because on both my normal and hard difficulty playthroughs I achieved over 80%. No incredibly high skill ceiling that'd be satisfying to strive to, no uniquely difficult segments that'd be fulfilling to master, no complex world map to enjoy memorizing and navigating, no highly emotionally investing story that's worth experiencing again, and any other reason you can personally fabricate that make a game worthy of replaying. One could argue that not all games must be played multiple times. Indeed, I've played and only ever will play Shadow of the Colossus once because I don't want the savory taste left on my palate tainted by another playthrough. But Blind Forest evidences to us that the devs had in mind for it to be played multiple times. The two major pieces of evidence are the percentage counter and the one life difficulty. If you didn't intend for replays, then there'd be no need for the percentage, and one can only expect a player to beat a game like this one in one life if they've played it before. Unsurprisingly, difficulty doesn't change the enemy AI behavior or object and enemy placement in the world, but simply deals more damage to Ori and presumably renders Ori's damage less, well, damaging. The hard playthrough was hardly different from the normal one. Blind Forest forewent traditional bosses in preference for a less segmented style, but I think Blind Forest would have benefited from bosses because the developers did a great job in creating enemies with unique traits, appearances, and behaviors. So I think Blind Forest's gameplay would increase in player engagement if the devs used their skills to create equally unique bosses that exploit the game's mechanics in novel ways. I believe designers have 3 pillars of game design at their disposal to manipulate: player avatar complexity, environment complexity, and obstacle and enemy complexity. A game can only safely manage maximizing 2 of these pillars, but minimizing all 3 pillars would generate a stringently boring game. For example, Fury has low player avatar complexity because you only have 5 simple actions: move, shoot, sword attack, dash, and parry. It has extremely low environmental complexity because you fight on a 2D space, either with no hard features on it or very few simple acting ones. But it has extremely high enemy complexity. Like, just look at this. Dark Souls is roughly in the middle of all categories. Your available actions are similar to those in Fury, but equipment changes your options. The world map is complex enough to be worth memorizing, and you must train your attention when fighting enemies because you'll otherwise die. There's more than one way to successfully navigate through these 3 pillars. Now, looking at Ori and the Blind Forest, it has medium to higher player avatar complexity because you have many actions available to you as evidenced by this ability wheel, though you only use a small number of them at any given time. Medium environment complexity because you must intermittently solve mild puzzles and often need to carefully maneuver about a screen, but low enemy complexity because each creature has one action it performs. These guys roll, these guys shoot, and these guys jump. That description somewhat neighbors Dark Souls, but what's the difference? Bosses. Battlefield. I keep saying Battlefield because in the script I write BF as an abbreviation so I don't have to type out Blind Forest every single time. But every time I read BF, I read Battlefield. Blind Forest is primarily about navigating the screen with your currently available abilities, but even exploiting Ori's abilities in unique ways can get old, but I suppose that's why it's a short game. But I praise it for that. A game is only long if it repeats its exploitations, but Blind Forest introduces a concept, plays around with it until it exhausts all its interesting possibilities, then ends. However, bosses would be an excellent way to elevate that minimal enemy variety to a higher level and make the game more interesting and make that repeat playthrough more inviting. The following is an eternal dichotomy of game design philosophy that has a different answer in every context. If a player initiates an action like a ground pound, are they responsible for any damage they may take during the animation? From one perspective, they should be because it was their decision to initiate the action, but from the other perspective, they shouldn't be because on-screen information can change so rapidly that it'd be absurd to subject the player to any unlikely to predict changes. In the case of Blind Forest, invincibility frames, or iframes, seem never to be granted. You can take damage while Ori spins during the beginning of the ground pound animation, as well as when Ori is quickly moving down. I believe the former should be punishable, but the latter should not, because the spin Ori does starts at Ori's exact position when you press down. So I think that it's trivial to predict if a projectile is going to hit you at your current location, which is what you have to do while playing the game anyway. But the part of the ground pound when Ori is moving down should not be punishable because that is the damage dealing segment of the animation. If you're dealing damage with your body, it doesn't make sense for you to also take damage at the same time. And notice that I said dealing damage with your body, so if you're simply using sign to deal damage to enemies, Ori would still be open to taking damage. As it follows, the two most logical available solutions here are either attaching iframes to that part of the animation or adding some type of interaction with enemies and projectiles to the sides and top of Ori. The interaction could take one of two forms. The first alternative is to simply nullify any damage that would be taken. For example, if a projectile from a mortar or slime enemy would hit Ori, then it would be annihilated and deal no damage. The second alternative is to deflect the object as if Ori were a wall. So, if a projectile would hit the protagonist, it would bounce off and proceed in another direction, and if the projectile then hit an enemy, it would deal damage because all enemies in this game have friendly fire against one another. If an enemy hit Ori, like a dash owl, it would simply bounce off as if the owl hit a wall, and no damage would be dealt. The lattermost choice is the most optimal because it punishes no player, but allows those with quick reactions to improvise strategies to avoid damage and quickly navigate about the level, also adding subtle complexity to the player's available mobility options, which elevates the skill ceiling without raising the skill floor. You can sustain damage while suspending the game during the bash ability. I'd improve bash by allowing the player to regain the health they lost if hit by a bashable projectile or enemy by bashing while the object is still near. This, again, punishes no player but only rewards attentive and quick reacting ones. And this suggestion features a built-in failsafe of discarding damage to Ori if the bash button is pressed even a millisecond after taking damage from poor timing. You'd be valid in asserting that it's the player's fault for poorly timing their bash in the first place, but I propose that taking damage simultaneous to pressing the button is excessive because the game sometimes requires highly precise timing with bash to achieve a high enough altitude. Now, more than any other assertion I have or will mention in this video, I think this is my weakest one, and I stand by it the least confidently. If you believe otherwise about my assertions about bash being able to recover health, I'd be most convincible on this subject than any other. I add this disclaimer because a large part of me wants to tell any player, including myself, to get good and don't get hit in the first place. In the ice level, after using the gummo seal, the gravitationally attractive orange blocks aren't attractive in all directions. To stick to one, you must jump on its top, and you can then walk around its perimeter. I understand why the devs did this because it initially makes sense to our human brains because we intuitively understand gravity is pulling down, but it makes little sense in the context of the pieces operation and these puzzles. I gauge that a more sensible nature of this block is if it's uniformly attractive in all directions relative to the block center. When you jump at one, you should be pulled toward the surface at a certain radius uniformly around the square. And of course, you can qualify this by adding a maximum velocity to its ability to attract you to prevent you from sticking to the surface of this middle block here when passing by. As mentioned earlier, enemy variety is low. I detect only 9 enemy types, as shown. 17 in total exist, but several are reiterations of a similar design, like having a slime in fire form, ice form, poison form, etc. I have comments on specific enemy behavior, but I've already expressed my opinions on the enemy's design approach en masse. So, I've noticed that sometimes a slime enemy ejects projectiles after dying, but not always, and I haven't spotted what triggers its last stand. I wonder if I can reiterate this point too many times, but when the effects of an action aren't obvious, it can easily lead to frustration, or at least it did in my case, because I'd move under the presumption that the projectiles wouldn't eject after its death, and especially if I already knew the geometry of an area, but then be surprised by the needles or fireballs flying at me. Failures of consideration present themselves throughout the game's entirety. Not the most grievous, but one of the most eccentric instances is during this gliding segment near the end. This appears as straightforward as it is. Avoid the bramble and collect the keystones to open the spirit gate. But something happened to me that discombobulated me so profoundly that I don't even think it annoyed me. It just perplexed me. Here, take a look. Then I'll explain afterwards if you didn't catch it. Did you catch that? In a segment that exclusively requires constant gliding, Ori held onto the damaging bramble instead of deploying the feather and floating up. Why is this even possible? Why isn't Crow's Feather the default action in that context and climb disabled? It makes so little sense to me that really all I can do is mention how dumb it is. I mentioned in the intro that Blind Forest is one of the most frustrating games I've played recently, which is notable because both as a person and a gamer, I'm not easily ruffled. And I peg that to my best friend growing up having ADHD and neglecting to take his medication for months at a time. And I think that hardens my patience, you know? You wouldn't believe me when I say that I didn't become frustrated even once on my first Dark Souls playthrough, which was my first Souls game, because I felt that each of my deaths were valid and justified, and I understood why they happened. Blind Forest is not an authentically difficult game, but rather one that imposes its difficulty through betraying your trust. Despite what it has seemed like, I recommend that you play Ori and the Blind Forest if you think that you'll be into this kind of game. It's a mostly well-composed platformer, but it's also a prototypical example of a just not right game, or one that seems like something is off in its game feel sometimes, but you're unsure precisely why.